October 12th, 1492. The moment when everything changed, when the world expanded beyond the maps of old Europe, when Christopher Columbus set foot upon an island he would call San Salvador. And in that moment, history took a breath, held it, and prepared to write itself differently than it had planned. Because what if the fever that should have taken him in 1506, weak and struggling in Valladolid, Spain, what if that fever broke? What if his body, worn by years of ocean crossings and battles with nobles and the crown, what if it found some strange resilience, some quality no physician could name? The world discovered him once, but tonight, we explore what might have happened if he discovered centuries upon centuries more, if Christopher Columbus never died, if he continued walking through time itself, an immortal witness to the consequences of his own voyages. Close your eyes and drift backward with me to that impossible moment, when death came for the admiral of the ocean sea, and found no one home. He lies there, in a modest room, far from the glory he imagined, far from the riches he believed were his due. His body should surrender, his breath should still, but instead, something shifts. The fever cools, the pain recedes, and Christopher Columbus opens his eyes to a world that will never stop changing, a world he helped create, and now must endure forever. The physicians gather around his bed, pressing cool cloths to his forehead, murmuring prayers in Latin, preparing for the inevitable. But the inevitable does not come. His pulse strengthens. His breathing deepens. His eyes, clouded with delirium just hours before, clear and focus on the wooden beams of the ceiling above him. They call it a miracle. And perhaps it is. Though what kind of miracle grants eternal life to a man whose actions have unleashed forces he cannot control, cannot undo, cannot escape? In the days that follow, as he sits up, as he eats again, as color returns to his face and strength to his limbs, he begins to sense that something fundamental has changed within him. Something beyond the simple recovery from illness, something that whispers of impossibility, of time stretching out before him not in years but in centuries, in epochs, in eras beyond counting. The first decades are the strangest, because he doesn't understand what has happened to him. He recovers slowly, impossibly, and those around him whisper of miracles, of divine favor, of the Lord preserving his chosen navigator for some greater purpose yet unseen. Columbus himself believes this. He has always believed himself chosen, destined, marked by providence to unite the world under Christian dominion. But the years pass. 1510, 1520, 1530, and he does not age. His hair remains the white it turned in his 50s, his hands still steady, his vision still sharp. He watches contemporaries die. Ferdinand and Isabella, both gone, the monarchs who gave him ships and titles and then took away his governorship in chains. He remembers that humiliation, walking through Seville in irons, convinced his legacy would be one of disgrace. Now he outlives them, outlives their children, outlives the courts that judged him. And slowly, carefully, he begins to understand. He will outlive everything. The Spanish Empire grows fat on the gold and silver flowing from the Americas, the very lands he claimed for the crown. He sees the ships returning, heavy with treasure, and he remembers the Taíno people of Hispaniola, their kindness in those first encounters, the way they brought him gifts of parrots and gold trinkets, the way they smiled and welcomed these strange visitors from across the ocean. He wonders, in the quiet hours, What became of them? Deep in his heart, beneath layers of justification and divine purpose, a small voice asks questions he cannot fully silence. By 1540, he has begun moving through Spain under assumed names, taking work on merchant vessels, keeping his head down, avoiding anyone who might recognize the admiral from portraits or descriptions. He learns to lie about his age, to claim he is the son or grandson of Christopher Columbus, to deflect questions about why he looks so remarkably like the explorer. The deception becomes second nature, because the alternative is impossible to explain, impossible for others to accept, impossible even for him to fully comprehend. He watches his legitimate son Diego die, watches his grandchildren grow old and die, watches the family line continue without him as he pretends to be distant relatives, cousins, descendants of the great navigator rather than the man himself. By 1550, Christopher Columbus is a legend and a ghost, moving through Spain under different names, watching the world he helped birth take shapes he never imagined. The conquistadors have carved empires from the flesh of civilizations. Cortés in Mexico, Pizarro in Peru, and Columbus watches, unable to look away, as the pattern he set in motion repeats across an entire hemisphere. He sails again, quietly, aboard ships that follow routes he pioneered, and he sees the plantations rising on Caribbean islands, the sugar fields worked by hands that are no longer indigenous, because the Taíno are gone. Nearly all of them. The diseases his crews carried, the violence his governorship normalized, the enslavement his brothers initiated. These forces swept through the islands like a dark tide, like the storms that sometimes drove his ships off course during those first voyages. He stands on the shore of Hispaniola in 1555 and realizes he cannot find a single face that resembles those who greeted him in 1492. The villages are empty ruins, overgrown with jungle, reclaimed by the forest as though the people who lived there were never more than a dream. The weight of this, the sheer weight of this realization, settles into him like ballast in a ship's hold, necessary to keep him upright but heavy, so heavy, pulling him down toward depths he cannot name. He remembers claiming he had found a route to Asia, insisting until the end of his mortal years that Cuba was the Chinese mainland, that he had reached the lands of the Great Khan. But now, in this extended life, he can no longer maintain the fiction. These are new lands, a new world, as they call it, and he brought the old world's hungers here, brought the diseases and the weapons and the certainty that European civilization must inevitably triumph over all others. He walks through the streets of Santo Domingo, the first European city in the Americas, built on the foundations of Taíno villages, and he sees African slaves working in chains, brought here to replace the people who died, and the cycle of exploitation continues, transforms, adapts, but never ends. He tries to speak to some of the enslaved Africans, these people torn from their homelands just as the Taíno were destroyed in theirs, and he sees in their eyes the same humanity he saw in the Taíno, the same complexity and depth and richness of inner life that he failed to recognize in 1492, that his certainty in European superiority prevented him from seeing. And he understands, with a clarity that burns like fever, that he is responsible, not solely, not exclusively, but undeniably responsible for setting in motion the forces that brought these people here in chains, that built this economy on stolen labor, that normalized the treatment of human beings as property. The 17th century finds him wandering, perpetually wandering. He has learned to disappear, to avoid scrutiny, to move from city to city before anyone notices. He does not age, does not sicken, does not die. He witnesses the Dutch and English joining the Spanish and Portuguese in carving up the Americas, in establishing colonies, in bringing shiploads of African captives to replace the indigenous peoples who could not survive the contact. The transatlantic slave trade. He watches it grow from scattered ventures into a massive engine of human suffering, and he knows that the infrastructure he helped create made this possible. His voyages opened the door, and what walked through that door was not merely exploration or even conquest, but a reorganization of human life on a scale almost incomprehensible. He reads accounts of the Middle Passage, the ships packed with human beings in conditions worse than any cargo hold he ever saw, and he thinks of his own crews, how he struggled to keep them fed and healthy on those first crossings, how he rationed water and hardtack, how he worried about scurvy and storms. The irony is not lost on him. He preserved his men so carefully, and his success enabled a trade that would treat millions of people as less than cattle, as cargo to be packed efficiently, as commodities whose only value lay in their labor. In quiet moments, alone in rented rooms in Amsterdam or London or Lisbon, he writes, page after page of reflections, justifications, condemnations, confessions. He burns them all. Who would believe him? Who would care that Christopher Columbus, dead for over a century by official record, carries regrets heavier than any ocean he ever crossed? He attends a slave auction in 1680, standing in the back of the crowd, watching families separated, children torn from mothers, human beings examined like livestock, and he feels a nausea that has nothing to do with his immortal body, a sickness of the soul that no physician can treat, no prayer can heal. And yet he returns to these auctions, again and again, as though forcing himself to witness is some form of penance, some way of honoring the debt he can never repay. He tries, once, to buy a family and set them free, using money he has accumulated through careful investment and long years of modest living. But the laws prevent it, or the freed people are recaptured, or they have nowhere to go in a world that sees their skin and assumes enslavement. The systems are too large, too entrenched, too powerful for individual acts of conscience to overcome, and he realizes that his guilt, his regret, his desire to make amends, these are luxuries, personal feelings that do nothing to address the massive structural violence that continues regardless of how he feels about it. The 18th century brings enlightenment, they say, reason and science and the rights of man. Columbus watches the philosophers write their treatises, watches the coffee houses fill with debate about liberty and equality, and he notes, with bitter irony, that these same enlightened men see no contradiction in owning slaves, in profiting from sugar and tobacco harvested by captive hands, in building their philosophy of freedom on foundations of bondage. He is in Philadelphia in 1776, standing in the back of crowds as they read the Declaration of Independence, hearing those words about all men being created equal, about inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and he thinks about the Taíno who welcomed him, about the civilizations toppled in his wake, about the millions of Africans chained in the holds of ships still following routes he pioneered. The American colonies break from Britain. The revolutionary fervor speaks of freedom, yet the plantation economy continues. The westward expansion accelerates. the indigenous peoples of North America begin to experience what the Caribbean peoples experienced 3 centuries before. Columbus watches the pattern repeat, and he understands now that he is not merely witnessing history. He is witnessing the long, slow unfolding of consequences that began with his 4 voyages. Every colony, every plantation, every displaced people, every ship full of enslaved Africans, all of it traces back, in some measure, to October 12, 1492. He meets a Seneca elder in 1790, a man displaced by American expansion, forced from ancestral lands by treaties that were never honored, by promises that were made only to be broken, and they share a silence that communicates more than words ever could. 2 men who have seen their worlds destroyed by forces claiming divine mandate and manifest destiny, by empires that believe their expansion is natural law, inevitable as the tides. The elder asks him where he comes from, and Columbus says simply, "From across the ocean, a long time ago," and the elder nods, understanding something in those words that Columbus doesn't speak aloud, some recognition of shared displacement, shared witness to catastrophe. They sit together through the night, sharing food, sharing silence, and Columbus tells stories about the Taíno, about their villages and their kindness, about the world that existed before 1492. The elder listens with tears in his eyes, recognizing the pattern, understanding that what happened to the Taíno is happening now to his own people, that the catastrophe repeats across centuries and continents, that Columbus's voyages opened a door that cannot be closed. And in the morning, when they part, the elder places a hand on Columbus's shoulder and says simply, "Remember us, remember that we were here, that we lived, that we mattered." And Columbus promises, though he does not reveal that he will remember for centuries, that he cannot forget even if he wanted to. That memory is both his burden and his purpose. The 19th century, an age of steam and steel and industrial ambition. Columbus stands on the docks of New York Harbor, watching ships arrive from Europe carrying millions of immigrants, people seeking the opportunity that the New World supposedly offers, fleeing poverty and persecution and famine, arriving with hope and fear mixed together in their hearts. He sees Irish fleeing famine, Germans fleeing revolution, Italians fleeing poverty, and he sees, too, the ships still carrying enslaved people, though now illegally, smuggled past British patrols trying to enforce the abolition of the slave trade. He is there in 1865 when the American Civil War ends, when slavery is finally abolished in the United States, and he feels something like relief, but also recognition that this does not undo centuries, that this does not restore what was lost, that this is merely a first step in a journey of reckoning that will take generations more. He travels west with the wagon trains, sees the transcontinental railroad built, watches the buffalo herds slaughtered to near extinction, witnesses the final military campaigns against the Plains tribes, the confinement to reservations, the systematic destruction of indigenous ways of life. He stands at Wounded Knee in 1890 and sees the echo of Hispaniola, the same logic of elimination, the same certainty that civilization must triumph over savagery, that progress requires the erasure of peoples who lived on this land for thousands of years before European arrival. The world is connecting now in ways he dreamed of, but not the way he imagined. Steamships cross the Atlantic in days rather than weeks. Telegraph cables carry messages under the ocean in seconds. The global economy binds continents together in networks of trade and finance and exploitation. And everywhere, The pattern holds, wealth flowing from periphery to center, from the colonized to the colonizers, from the Americas and Africa and Asia to Europe and North America. He works briefly in a factory in Manchester, England, in 1870, experiencing the Industrial Revolution from the perspective of the workers whose labor powers it, and he sees how the cotton they process was picked by enslaved hands in America, how the wealth generated by colonial exploitation funds the machines that now dominate production, how everything is connected, how the web that began with his voyages has become a global system that no one fully controls but everyone participates in. The 20th century arrives with such speed, such terrible speed. Columbus watches the Great War tear Europe apart, watches empires collapse and new nations rise, and he wonders if this is the price, if the chickens of colonialism have finally come home to roost. The European powers that grew rich on empire now turn their industrial might against each other, and the slaughter is unprecedented, unimaginable, mechanized death on a scale that makes even the conquest of the Americas seem almost intimate by comparison. He walks through the trenches of the Somme in 1916, invisible among the dead and dying, stepping over bodies in mud, and he thinks about cycles, about violence breeding violence, about how the wealth extracted from the colonies funded the weapons now tearing young men apart in French mud, how the imperial competition for global dominance has come full circle and is now consuming the colonizers themselves. The interwar years bring him to the Caribbean again, to islands that have cycled through centuries of colonial rule, that are beginning to murmur about independence, about self-determination, about reclaiming sovereignty that was taken from them. He meets descendants of the enslaved, people whose ancestors survived the Middle Passage, who built lives and cultures and resistance in the face of impossible oppression, who created beauty and music and community despite everything the system tried to take from them. They do not know who he is. He is just another old man, wandering, listening, sitting in rum shops and listening to stories. But he knows who they are. They are the inheritors of the world he helped create, the survivors of the catastrophe he initiated, the living proof that human beings can endure almost anything and still find ways to live, to love, to create. The Second World War comes, and with it the Holocaust, the atomic bomb, the revelation of just how far human beings will go in the name of ideology and power. Columbus watches the newsreels from the concentration camps and sees, once again, the logic of elimination, the same logic that swept through the Caribbean, through the Americas, across Africa, now applied with industrial efficiency to European Jews, to Roma, to anyone deemed undesirable by the Rye. Different justifications, different targets, same fundamental belief that some lives matter less than others, that some peoples must be removed for others to thrive. He volunteers in a displaced persons camp in 1946, helping survivors of the Holocaust find food and shelter and some measure of safety, and he listens to their stories of survival, of loss, of communities destroyed, of families murdered, and he recognizes the pattern, sees the connection between the genocide of the Taíno and the genocide of European Jews, understands that the capacity for mass violence, for systematic elimination, for treating human beings as obstacles to be removed, this capacity runs through human history like a dark thread, and his voyages helped establish the infrastructure and justification for expressing it on a global scale. The post-war world reshapes itself, empires crumble, Colonies demand independence, and Columbus watches the decolonization movement with complicated feelings, with a mixture of hope and recognition that independence does not automatically undo centuries of exploitation, that sovereignty is only the beginning of a much longer journey toward genuine self-determination. He is in India in 1947, in Ghana in 1957, in Algeria in 1962, witnessing peoples reclaim sovereignty that was taken from them, watching flags rise and colonial administrators depart and new nations declare their existence to the world. He thinks about the Taíno, who never got this chance, who were eliminated before they could resist effectively, before they could build movements of independence, before they could survive long enough to see the global tide turn against colonialism. The civil rights movement in America, he follows it closely, watches the marches, hears Martin Luther King Jr. speak about justice and equality and the long arc of the moral universe bending toward justice, and he recognizes the long arc that finally seems to be bending, though so slowly, so painfully slowly, requiring such sacrifice from those who push it forward. But he also knows how long that arc is, how many generations suffered and died waiting for it to bend, how many people never lived to see the changes they fought for, how much longer the journey still is even now. He is in Havana when Castro takes power, sees the revolution promised to break free from American imperialism, to reclaim Cuban sovereignty after decades of exploitation, to redistribute land and wealth and power. The Cold War divides the world into new camps, capitalism versus communism. But Columbus sees beneath the ideologies to the continued competition for resources, for influence, for control over the very lands he claimed for Spain 5 centuries before. He watches the Vietnam War on television, the first televised war, and sees young Americans dying in Southeast Asian jungles, sees Vietnamese villages burned, sees napalm falling from the sky, sees the pattern of Western intervention continuing even as formal colonialism ends, transforming into new forms, new justifications, but fundamentally unchanged. The world is so connected now. Satellites orbit the Earth. Computers process information at impossible speeds. Jet planes cross oceans in hours rather than the months his voyages required. But the fundamental questions, who benefits, who suffers, who decides, these questions remain, stubbornly persistent, woven into the fabric of the global system he helped create. The late 20th century brings him to a world increasingly aware of its own history, increasingly willing to interrogate the narratives that previous generations accepted without question, to challenge the myths that sustained empire and justified conquest. In 1992, the 500th anniversary of his first voyage, Columbus watches the commemorations and protests with equal attention, with a sense of witnessing himself become a battleground for contemporary debates about history and memory and justice. Some celebrate him as a brave explorer, a visionary navigator, a figure who connected worlds and initiated the modern global age. Others condemn him as a colonizer, or enslaver, a harbinger of genocide, the man whose voyages began a process of destruction that killed millions and continues to shape inequalities today. Both are correct. He knows this now, has known it for centuries, carries both truths in his immortal body like contradictory currents in the same ocean. He is both things. The man who navigated uncharted waters with remarkable skill, who convinced skeptical monarchs to fund an impossible journey, who persevered through storms and near mutinies and weeks of open ocean, and the man who initiated processes that destroyed millions of lives, who enslaved the Taíno, who claimed lands that were already inhabited, who could not or would not recognize the humanity of the peoples he encountered. He cannot separate these identities. They are woven together like rope, like the rigging that held his sails 500 years ago, inseparable strands that only together create the whole. He attends academic conferences where scholars debate his legacy, where indigenous activists call for the removal of his statues, for the renaming of Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day, for a reckoning with the truth of what his voyages meant for the peoples of the Americas. He listens to Italian Americans defend him as a symbol of their heritage, of immigrant success in the New World, of the contributions of Italian culture to American society. And he understands that he has become a symbol, a contested space where different groups project their histories and identities and grievances, where the past is always present, always being reinterpreted, always serving the needs and arguments of the living. He is no longer simply Christopher Columbus, navigator from Genoa. He is Columbus, the representation of European expansion, of colonial violence, of cultural encounter, of the birth of the modern global system with all its complexities and contradictions. He watches a group of indigenous activists topple one of his statues in 1992, and instead of anger, he feels understanding. They are right to be angry. They are right to reject the sanitized narrative that ignores the genocide. They are right to insist on telling the full truth. And if destroying his image helps them reclaim their power, their voice, their rightful place in the history that tried to erase them, then perhaps that is justice of a sort, imperfect but necessary. The internet emerges in the 1990s, and suddenly the whole world is connected in ways that make his voyages seem quaint, almost charmingly primitive by comparison. Information circles the globe in seconds rather than months. People communicate across continents instantly. The barriers of distance that once made his journeys so perilous and uncertain dissolve into virtual networks that span the planet. Yet the inequalities he helped establish persist, transform but do not disappear. The global north and global south, the developed and developing worlds, the digital divide that mirrors older divides, the wealth gap that echoes, in so many ways, the colonial divide between metropole and periphery. He learns to use computers, slowly at first, then with growing fluency, accessing the vast archives of information now available at the touch of a keyboard. He reads scholarship about his voyages, sees his own letters and journals analyzed and debated, encounters interpretations of his motivations and psychology that sometimes surprise him with their insight, sometimes frustrate him with their misunderstanding. But he cannot correct them, cannot step forward and say, "Actually, this is what I was thinking, this is what I meant. This is how it really happened." Who would believe him? And what difference would it make? The past is fixed, unchangeable, and his testimony cannot undo what was done, cannot restore the Taíno to life, cannot free the millions who died in slavery, cannot heal the wounds that continue to mark the descendants of those catastrophes. So he remains silent, anonymous, watching the debates rage on message boards and in academic journals, seeing his name invoked by people who have no idea he is still alive, still here, still carrying the memory of everything that happened. The 21st century, his 6th century of life. Christopher Columbus stands in a world transformed beyond anything he could have imagined in 1492. Yet haunted by patterns he recognizes all too well, patterns that reach back through centuries to decisions made on wooden ships crossing an unknown ocean. Climate change emerges as the defining crisis of the new century, and he sees, with the clarity of centuries, how this too traces back to the Columbian exchange, to the global economic system his voyages helped initiate, to the industrial exploitation of resources in colonized lands, to the carbon-intensive development model that enriched the colonizers while extracting wealth from the colonized. The Caribbean islands he first encountered are now threatened by rising seas, stronger hurricanes, warming waters that bleach the coral reefs and disrupt the ecosystems that sustained human life here for thousands of years before his arrival. The indigenous peoples who survived, and some did survive, against all odds, maintaining their cultures through centuries of oppression, passing down languages and traditions and memories from generation to generation. They speak out about environmental justice, about the connections between colonialism and ecological destruction, about how the same forces that tried to eliminate them are now threatening the very survival of the islands themselves. He listens to them, these descendants of worlds he helped shatter, and he learns what he could not learn in 1492, what his certainty in European superiority prevented him from seeing, that the wisdom he dismissed as primitive contained truths about sustainable living, about balance with nature, about community over individual accumulation, about ways of being human that do not require the endless growth and extraction that characterizes the global economy he helped birth. He watches the Black Lives Matter movement, sees the protests against police violence, against systemic racism, against the ongoing consequences of slavery and Jim Crow and mass incarceration, and he understands that the chain of causation is real, that what began in 1492 did not end in 1865 or 1965 or even now. The structures persist, adapt, find new forms, new justifications, but the fundamental pattern of racial hierarchy and exploitation continues, woven so deeply into the fabric of society that rooting it out requires more than legal changes, more than policy reforms, requires a transformation of consciousness, of how people understand themselves and each other and the history that made the present world. He attends a Black Lives Matter march in 2020, wearing a mask during the pandemic, standing in a crowd of thousands demanding justice for George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and countless others, and he holds a sign that says simply remember the Taíno, because he wants people to understand that the violence is not new, that the devaluation of black and brown lives has roots that go back centuries, that the struggle for justice must reckon with the full depth of history if it hopes to transform the future. He walks through cities now that didn't exist when he was born. Sao Paulo, New York, Mexico City, Lagos, megacities that hold millions of people, that pulse with the energy of global capitalism, global culture, global connection. Cities built on foundations laid by the colonial period, shaped by forces unleashed in that first encounter between Europe and the Americas. And in all of them, he sees the legacy of 1492. The mixing of peoples that his voyages initiated, sometimes voluntary, often forced, always complicated, creating populations that embody the collision of worlds in their very bodies, in their languages that blend European and indigenous and African elements, in their cuisines that fuse ingredients from every continent, in their music that carries rhythms and melodies from distant origins. The cultural hybridity, the blended languages, the fusion cuisines, the mixed-race populations, these are, in some sense, his children. Not the biological children he had with Beatrice and Felipa, but the cultural children of the collision he caused, the living embodiment of a world remade by contact and conquest and survival. He meets a woman in Santo Domingo, a biologist studying the recovery of Caribbean ecosystems, documenting the species that survived and those that went extinct, measuring the health of coral reefs and mangrove forests, working to restore habitats that were damaged by centuries of exploitation. She tells him about species that went extinct in the years after 1492, about forests that never recovered, about the ecological transformation that accompanied the human catastrophe, about how the introduction of European livestock and crops and diseases didn't just kill people but reshaped entire ecosystems, creating landscapes that bear little resemblance to what existed before contact. She doesn't know she's talking to the man who initiated it all, but her passion, her commitment to restoration, to healing the wounds, to building something better from the wreckage of the past, it moves him, gives him something he hasn't felt in a very long time. Hope that the story isn't finished, that the consequences of 1492 are still unfolding but might yet unfold towards something better, toward repair and justice and reconciliation. He begins to wonder, for the first time in centuries, if there might be some way to contribute to repair rather than simply bearing witness to damage, if his immortality might serve some purpose beyond endless observation and regret. But what could he do? He is a relic, a walking anachronism, a man whose skills, navigation by stars, management of wooden sailing ships, reading ocean currents and wind patterns, are utterly obsolete in an age of GPS and satellite weather tracking and container ships guided by computers. His knowledge of the world in 1492 is useful only to historians, and even then, only if he could reveal himself, which he cannot, which would create more problems than it solved. And yet he has seen the long arc, the full consequences, the way decisions echo through centuries, the way violence and exploitation create wounds that take generations to heal, the way structures established in one era constrain possibilities in future eras. Perhaps there is value in that, in being the one person who can testify to the full sweep of what happened after that October day in 1492, who carries in his memory the direct experience of how the world was before and how it became what it is now. He begins to write again, more systematically this time, creating detailed accounts of what he saw, what he did, what he understands now that he couldn't understand then. He describes the Taíno villages in 1492, the way they were organized, the beauty of their pottery and their understanding of agriculture and their complex social relationships. He describes the ships, the crews, the politics of the Spanish court, the calculations and miscalculations that shaped his voyages. He describes the centuries since, the patterns he observed, the way colonialism functioned, the mechanisms of exploitation and resistance, the long shadow cast by those first encounters. And he publishes these writings, carefully, anonymously, releasing them through historical societies, through academic journals, through indigenous organizations, making them available to scholars and activists and anyone seeking to understand the past more fully. The COVID-19 pandemic arrives in 2020, and Columbus experiences something he hasn't felt in 5 centuries, the fear of disease, not for himself but for the world. Not for himself. He is apparently immune to illness now, part of whatever strange immortality he possesses, able to walk through plague wards without infection, to tend the sick without falling ill himself. But watching the world shut down, watching the virus spread along the very trade routes and transportation networks that descend from the global connections his voyages helped forge, he sees the Columbian exchange in reverse, sees how the interconnected world creates vulnerabilities as well as opportunities, how disease can travel as fast as goods and information, how the same networks that enable prosperity can transmit catastrophe. In 1492, European diseases devastated American populations who had no immunity, who had no evolutionary exposure to smallpox and measles and influenza, who died in numbers so vast that entire civilizations collapsed. In 2020, a virus emerges in one part of the world and spreads everywhere, facilitated by the global interconnection that began, in part, with his voyages, with the opening of regular contact between continents that had been separated for thousands of years. The parallels are not exact, but they echo, resonate, remind him that the world he helped create is still producing consequences, still unfolding patterns that reach back to that first encounter. He thinks about the Taíno dying of smallpox, about the Aztecs ravaged by disease, about the 90% population decline in the Americas in the century after contact, about how his crew, his sailors, probably carried the germs that killed millions, without knowing, without intending, but carrying them nonetheless, introducing them to populations that had no defense. Intention and consequence. He has had centuries to contemplate this distinction, and he knows that history judges by consequences more than intentions, that the road to catastrophe is often paved with purposes that seemed reasonable or even noble at the time. He meant to find a route to Asia, to spread Christianity, to gain glory and wealth for himself and for Spain. But what he actually did was initiate a process that reshaped the entire world, that destroyed some civilizations and empowered others, that created the modern global system with all its benefits and horrors, its connectivity and inequality, its wealth and violence. He volunteers at a hospital during the pandemic, helping overwhelmed staff care for patients, using his immortality to do work that would be dangerous for mortal healthcare workers, and he finds a strange peace in the work, in being useful, in serving rather than simply witnessing, in doing something concrete to help people rather than just carrying the weight of historical guilt. The pandemic fades, eventually, as pandemics do, and the world emerges changed, as worlds always do after catastrophe, carrying new awareness, new questions, new recognition of vulnerability and interdependence. Columbus finds himself drawn, more and more, to memorials and museums, places where history is remembered, contested, preserved, places where the past is given physical form and made available to the living. He stands in the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, reading the testimonies of indigenous peoples, seeing the artifacts of cultures that survived despite everything, despite genocide and forced removal and cultural suppression and centuries of policies designed to eliminate them. He visits the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool, walks through exhibits documenting the Middle Passage, the plantation economy, the resistance and rebellion of the enslaved, the long struggle for freedom and dignity. He goes to the memorial at Wounded Knee, to the slave fort at Goree Island, to the ruins of Taíno villages in the Caribbean, to places where the violence he helped initiate is remembered, where the dead are honored, where the survivors' descendants come to connect with ancestors and history. In each place, He is both perpetrator and witness, both the one who set forces in motion and the one who has watched those forces play out across centuries, who carries the memory of what was lost, who knows what the world was like before the catastrophe. He begins to write again, not justifications this time, not defenses or explanations or attempts to make himself look better, but simply testimony. He writes about what he saw in 1492, about the Taíno who greeted him with such openness, about their villages and their agriculture and their art, about the beauty of the islands before European diseases and violence swept through like a hurricane that never ended. He writes about the centuries since, about the patterns he's observed, about the way violence and exploitation become normalized, become invisible to those who benefit from them, become woven into the fabric of society so deeply that people can participate in them without recognizing what they are doing. He publishes these writings anonymously, releasing them through historical societies, academic journals, indigenous organizations, letting them enter the world without his name attached, without claiming credit or seeking recognition, simply offering what he knows to those who might benefit from it. They are attributed to various scholars, to researchers, to activists, to anonymous sources with deep historical knowledge. No one suspects they are the work of a single immortal man who has witnessed it all, who was there in 1492 and is still here in 2025, carrying the full weight of 5 centuries in his memory. But the words enter the conversation, join the ongoing debate about history, memory, responsibility, and repair, offer perspectives and details that sometimes surprise scholars with their specificity and insight. How does this anonymous source know such details about Taíno village life? About the exact nature of Columbus's relationship with the Spanish crown? About the private doubts and regrets he expressed in letters that were never preserved? The academics puzzle over these sources, cite them cautiously, wonder about their provenance and reliability. And Columbus watches from a distance, seeing his testimony take root in the scholarly conversation, seeing it used by indigenous activists arguing for recognition and restitution, seeing it become part of the ongoing effort to understand and reckon with the past. This, he thinks, might be enough, might be the purpose his immortality serves, not to change what happened, which is impossible, not to absolve himself, which would be inappropriate, but to offer testimony, to ensure that the full truth is available to those who seek it, to provide evidence and perspective that might help the living build a better future from the wreckage of the past. 2024, and the political landscape is fractured, polarized, angry in ways that remind him of other periods of instability and transition he has witnessed. Columbus watches the rise of new nationalist movements, the resistance to immigration, the backlash against globalization, the resurgence of ethnic and racial animosity that he recognizes from darker periods of history. He sees echoes of the fear that drove the Spanish Inquisition, that motivated the conquest of the Americas, that justified slavery and genocide, the fear of the other, the desire for purity, the belief that safety comes through domination and exclusion rather than through cooperation and mutual recognition. But he also sees the opposite, movements for global cooperation, for addressing climate change collectively, for recognizing shared humanity across borders and cultures, for building systems that prioritize justice and sustainability over endless growth and extraction. The world contains both impulses, always has, always will, the impulse toward domination and the impulse toward solidarity, the tendency to build walls and the tendency to build bridges, the fear of difference and the celebration of diversity. His own life embodies this tension. The navigator who crossed oceans to connect distant peoples, and the colonizer who initiated their subjugation, the man who wanted to unite the world under Christian dominion, and the man who unleashed forces that destroyed millions of lives. He cannot resolve this contradiction. It is simply the truth of what he is, what he did, what he set in motion, and he has learned, across 5 centuries, to hold both truths simultaneously, to accept that he is neither hero nor villain but something more complex, more human, more real than either category allows. In the Caribbean now, there are movements to reclaim indigenous identity, to revive Taíno language and culture, to assert that the indigenous peoples of the islands did not entirely disappear, that survivors and their descendants exist, mixed with African and European populations, yes, but carrying forward something of those first peoples, maintaining connection to traditions and knowledge systems that predate 1492. Columbus meets some of these activists, these cultural revivalists working to recover and preserve what remains of Taíno heritage, and he tells them, carefully, obliquely, in ways that don't reveal his impossible identity, about the people he met in 1492, about their generosity, their joy, their sophisticated understanding of their environment, their complex social structures and spiritual practices, their artistic traditions and agricultural techniques. He does not reveal who he is, but he offers them what he can, the testimony of someone who was there, who saw, who remembers, who carries in his memory details that have been lost to time and conquest and the deliberate erasure of indigenous histories. They listen with hunger, with appreciation, with the deep need of people reclaiming a heritage that was nearly erased, that survived only in fragments and oral traditions and the mixed ancestry of contemporary Caribbean peoples. And he feels, for the first time in centuries, that he is contributing something positive, something that might help heal rather than harm, that might support the work of recovery and restoration rather than simply witnessing the ongoing consequences of destruction. He dreams sometimes, even after all these centuries, even with immortality apparently freeing him from the vulnerabilities of mortal flesh, he still dreams. And in his dreams, he is back on the Santa Maria, approaching that first island, seeing the shore appear on the horizon, the green hills rising from the impossibly blue water, the beaches of white sand, the people gathering to watch these strange ships approach their home. But in the dream, he makes different choices. In the dream, he turns the ship around, sails back to Spain, reports to Ferdinand and Isabella that there is nothing out there but ocean, that the route to Asia remains undiscovered, that the world is larger and more complex than anyone imagined. In the dream, he never makes landfall, never claims the islands for Spain, never initiates the cascade of consequences that would follow, never sets in motion the forces that would kill millions and reshape the world. In the dream, the Taíno live on. The civilizations of the Americas develop without European interference. The transatlantic slave trade never happens. The world unfolds along different paths, toward different futures, carrying different consequences. The dream is sweet and terrible. Sweet because it imagines so much suffering prevented. Terrible because he knows it is only a dream, that he cannot change what happened, that the world that exists is the world his choices helped create, that there is no going back, no undoing, no reset that would erase the past and allow a different future to emerge. He wakes from these dreams in the small apartments he rents in anonymous cities, and he lies there in the dark, feeling the weight of 532 years, the accumulated memory of centuries, the impossible burden of being the one person who remembers it all, who cannot forget, who cannot escape into the mercy of death that releases everyone else from the need to carry the past forever. Sometimes he wonders if this immortality is a punishment, if some cosmic justice decided that the man who initiated so much consequence should be forced to witness all of it, to live through every ramification, every echo, every long-term effect, to carry the knowledge and the guilt and the complexity forever, unable to die, unable to escape, unable to find peace in endings. He cannot die, cannot escape into the peace of endings. He can only endure, witness, remember. And perhaps there is a purpose in that. Perhaps the universe needs someone who carries the full memory, who cannot forget, who cannot allow the past to become comfortable or sanitized or simplified, who holds the truth in all its complexity and contradiction, and refuses to let it be reduced to easy narratives or convenient myths. The question of purpose haunts him increasingly as the years continue their relentless march forward, as the world changes faster and faster, as technologies emerge that would have seemed like magic to the people of 1492, as the consequences of his actions continue to unfold in ways he could never have anticipated. What is he meant to do with this impossible longevity? If it is divine will, as he once believed about everything in his life, about his calling to the sea and his visions of reaching Asia and his certainty that providence guided his ships across the ocean, then what does God want from him? Endless witnessing? Eternal penance? Or perhaps there is no divine plan. Perhaps this is simply an accident, a biological anomaly, a glitch in the universe that granted him immortality without meaning or purpose, without design or intention, just a random occurrence in a cosmos that doesn't care about human suffering or human hope. He has tried, over the centuries, to die, walked into the ocean, hoping to drown, feeling the water close over his head but finding that his lungs didn't need air, that he could walk on the ocean floor indefinitely without suffocating. Stood in the path of charging cavalry during the 30 Years' War, hoping a sword or musket ball would end him, but finding that blades couldn't penetrate his skin, that bullets struck him and fell away harmlessly. Caught every plague and epidemic he encountered, smallpox and cholera and yellow fever and influenza, and everything else that has swept through human populations across 5 centuries. But the diseases cannot take hold. His body repels them, refuses to succumb. He is trapped in life, in consciousness, in memory, unable to escape from himself, from his past, from the consequences of his actions. Some nights this feels like hell, the worst hell imaginable, worse than any fire or torture the church threatens sinners with, to be unable to escape from yourself, from your memories, from the knowledge of what you've done and what it led to, from the endless accumulation of witness and regret and understanding. But other times he finds something like peace, something like acceptance, something approaching grace in the simple fact of continued existence. He watches a sunrise over the Atlantic, seeing the same ocean he crossed 5 centuries ago, the same sun that rose over the Santa Maria as it sailed west into unknown waters, and he feels the sheer wonder of existence, of awareness, of being present for this moment and all the moments that have accumulated into his impossible life. He begins to see patterns in the newer generations, patterns that give him something he hasn't felt in a very long time, hope that the story isn't finished, that human beings are capable of learning, of changing, of building something better from the materials history has given them. Young people questioning the systems they inherited, refusing to accept that things must continue as they have, demanding justice and sustainability and recognition of historical wrongs, insisting that another world is possible if people are willing to work for it, to sacrifice for it, to imagine beyond the constraints of the present. He watches Greta Thunberg speak truth to power about climate change, watches the students marching for gun control, watches Black Lives Matter activists insisting that no one is free until everyone is free, watches Indigenous youth reviving languages and traditions that were nearly lost, watches movements for environmental justice and economic equality and decolonization spread across the globe, connected by the same technologies that spread exploitation and inequality, but now being used to organize resistance, to build solidarity, to imagine and work toward different futures. These young people, they are fighting against structures that trace back, in part, to the world he helped create, to the colonial legacies and racial hierarchies and economic systems that emerged from 1492 and the centuries of exploitation that followed. And yet they are not paralyzed by that history. They are energized by the possibility of change, of doing things differently, of building something better, of healing wounds that have festered for generations. He envies them their hope, but he also contributes to it, in small ways, in anonymous ways, using the resources his immortality has allowed him to accumulate. He funds scholarships for Indigenous students, supports their education and their efforts to reclaim and preserve their cultures, donates to organizations working on environmental restoration in the Caribbean, on replanting native forests, on protecting coral reefs, on building sustainable economies that don't require endless extraction. Supports museums and memorials dedicated to telling the full truth of colonial history, to honoring the victims, to educating future generations about what happened and why it matters. The money comes from investments he made centuries ago, carefully managed and grown through patient accumulation, through understanding that time is his greatest asset, that he can wait decades or centuries for returns that mortal investors could never realize. He has no need for wealth himself. He lives simply, modestly, anonymously, renting small apartments in unremarkable neighborhoods, eating simple food, owning few possessions, moving frequently to avoid questions about why he never ages, why he has no family, why he seems to exist outside the normal patterns of human life. But the money can do something, can support the work of healing and repair and justice, can contribute in small ways to the massive task of building a more equitable and sustainable world from the wreckage of colonialism and slavery and environmental destruction. It is not enough. It will never be enough to balance the scales, to compensate for the millions who died, to restore what was lost, to undo the centuries of violence and exploitation. But it is something, and after centuries of passive witnessing, after so long simply observing and remembering and regretting, doing something feels necessary, essential, like finally learning to breathe after holding his breath for 500 years. He volunteers sometimes, carefully, in ways that don't draw attention, working with organizations that serve the descendants of those his voyages harmed. He tutors students in poor neighborhoods, helps elderly people with their groceries, plants trees in community gardens, attends protests and marches, adding his body to the crowd, his presence to the movement, his silent support to the work of change. No one knows who he is. He is just another volunteer, another activist, another person showing up to do the work. But he knows that this is the least he can do, the minimum requirement for someone who carries the responsibility he carries, who helped create the problems these movements are trying to solve. And now, in 2026, Christopher Columbus stands on a beach in the Bahamas, very close to where he first made landfall in 1492. And he watches the waves roll in, eternal, indifferent, constant despite everything that human beings have done in their brief dominion over the earth, unchanged by the catastrophes and triumphs and transformations that have marked these past 5 centuries. The sand beneath his feet contains particles that were here 5 centuries ago, when the Taíno walked this beach, when the world was different, when the future was not yet written, when the peoples of these islands had no idea that ships were crossing the ocean toward them, carrying diseases and weapons and ambitions that would transform everything. But also, the sand contains particles that are new, that arrived with the tides, that will wash out again with the next storm, that are part of the constant cycling of matter and energy that continues regardless of human history. Continuity and change, together, inseparable, like the rope that held his sails, like the currents that carried his ships, like the forces that connect past and present and future into a single continuous flow. He thinks about all the people he has met across these centuries, all the lives that touched his, all the voices that spoke to him about their experiences, their hopes, their pain, their dreams of better futures or their memories of better pasts. They are all gone now. Even those he met just decades ago are mostly dead, returned to the earth, their memories scattered among descendants who may or may not remember them, their stories absorbed into the collective memory that is always being rewritten, always being contested, always serving the needs of the present. He alone remains, the perpetual witness, the immortal memory, the one person who carries the direct experience of 1492 and everything that followed, who cannot forget, who cannot escape into the mercy of death, who must endure and remember and testify as long as this impossible life continues. And he understands, finally, after all these centuries of wondering and questioning and searching for meaning, he understands that this is his purpose, not to judge, not to absolve, not to explain or justify or make excuses, but simply to remember, to hold the full truth of what happened, the glory and the horror, the achievement and the catastrophe, the human complexity that cannot be reduced to either condemnation or celebration, the reality that people are capable of both great courage and terrible cruelty, often simultaneously, often within the same actions and decisions. To remember the Taíno as they were, in their full humanity, not as primitive savages or noble victims, but as people, as human beings with their own cultures and values and ways of being in the world, who deserved to live, who deserved to continue their stories, whose loss is a tragedy that can never be undone. To remember the enslaved, the millions who died in the Middle Passage or on plantations, who were treated as property but were people, who suffered and resisted and survived and built cultures and communities despite everything the system tried to take from them. To remember the conquistadors and colonizers too, not as monsters but as people, as human beings who believed they were doing right, who justified their actions with religion and civilization and progress, who could be both cruel and kind, both greedy and generous, both visionary and blind. To hold all of it, the full complexity, and to make it available to those who seek to understand, who refuse to accept simple narratives, who recognize that building a better future requires honest engagement with the past, with all its contradictions and complications and uncomfortable truths. The sun sets over the Atlantic, casting gold across the water, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple that he has seen thousands of times across these centuries, but that still move him, still remind him that the world is beautiful despite the violence humans inflict on each other and on the earth, that there is wonder and grace available to those who pay attention, who remain open to it. And he watches it fall, this same sun that has set countless times during his impossible life, that will continue setting long after every human now alive has died, that will eventually expand and consume the earth in billions of years when all of human history is long forgotten, when the empires and nations and civilizations that seemed so important have crumbled to dust and been forgotten. But he will still be here, or so it seems, watching, remembering, carrying forward the past into whatever future unfolds, walking forward into the unknown just as he did on that October day in 1492 when he set sail into an ocean that held the future of the entire world. Time continues, history continues, and Christopher Columbus, the man who never died, continues with it, neither hero nor villain but witness, neither absolved nor condemned but simply present, carrying the weight of 534 years and counting, moving through a world that he helped create and that has far exceeded anything he imagined when he convinced Ferdinand and Isabella to fund 3 small ships for a voyage into the unknown. He does not know what tomorrow will bring. He has learned, across these centuries, that the future is always stranger than anyone predicts, that the consequences of actions are always larger and more complex than anyone intends, that history moves in directions no one controls. But he will be there to witness it, to remember it, to hold it in the vast archive of memory that his immortal mind has become, and perhaps, in some small way, to contribute to it, to nudge it toward justice and healing and repair, to honor the debt he can never fully repay to all those who died because of choices he made 534 years ago. The waves continue their eternal rhythm, rolling in and out, the same motion that has continued since long before humans existed and will continue long after humans are gone. And Christopher Columbus, the immortal navigator, stands at the edge of the ocean and watches, and remembers, and endures. He kneels down and touches the water, feeling it cool against his immortal skin, and he thinks of all the oceans he has crossed, all the shores he has touched, all the lives that intersected with his across more than 5 centuries of impossible existence. And he whispers a prayer, not to God, perhaps, or not to the God he once believed in with such certainty, but to the Taíno, to the enslaved, to all those who suffered and died because of the world he helped create, a prayer of remembrance, of acknowledgement, of witness. I remember you, he whispers to the waves. I will always remember you. And the ocean, ancient and indifferent, carries his words away into the endless blue.